Hello and welcome. Kelly and I are here today to share with you the Alveary book talk with the 2023-24 school year, all of the exciting books for grade 12. We are looking forward to working through some of our favorite old friends and new friends for the Alveary curriculum. Thanks for being with us here today. We're going to start off today with architecture, and we have a new book which we're very excited about. It's called What Adults Don't Know About Architecture. But lest you think that that's some sort of slam on adults, it's not. It really is about what we all don't know about architecture. And it's a great overview of just looking at the ideas behind architecture and even asking this question of what's beauty and how do we recognize it and why do we have different thoughts and opinions about that, and are there design elements behind architecture that actually contribute to something that's beautiful or not beautiful? So that's where your students will be looking at or using this book to kind of think through these ideas and then apply them not only to buildings that they may see around them, but buildings also that are from this time period. So we have used this book before, and we will continue now in using just this last section of it as it goes through the more 20th century buildings. But we'll be taking those ideas from the first book and now thinking about these buildings in light of what are the design principles behind that, and behind the different buildings that help us think about them in terms of, you know, what is lovely, what's beautiful, what gives us comfort and rest even as we think about architecture. So we're excited about those. And then looking at art, we always, for the high school years, we always try to find some sort of book that gives some background or maybe some interesting expansion about the artist's life. So we do different things, different years, different rotations. But one of the books for this year is called Harlem Stomp. And it is going to give the background for Jacob Lawrence, who is our artist for the second term. And it just really ties in well with the history of the time period and giving us a broader perspective of what was happening in the Harlem Renaissance and where did Jacob Lawrence fit and how did his pictures come about and what was he doing and what were the other people around him doing, and even all different aspects of music and art and literature and history. So it's not a specific book just to him or art, but it gives us sort of the setting for that. And so we're excited to see how that dovetails with the other history and literature readings and the other plays and music and everything else that's going on in the term.
For grade 12 Bible, the only thing that you should note is there is an addition of a specific study in Psalms during the last term of the year. And we have a couple of resources that we suggest that you use. You can use either A Long Obedience in the Same Direction, or you could use the John Chrysostom's commentary on the Psalms, volume 2, that will help you study along as you go through that whole term. We also have a very specific subject for church history in high school years. And we use two books for all four rotations that help bring the picture of what's going on at that time, at the time frame during church history. So it goes all the way from earlier times all the way through to mostly current times as well, depending upon what we're talking about. So we look at the movements and the actual history. They're not also theological or doctrinal. It's really looking at what's going on in the history of the church during that time. Grade 10 and 11 actually add when the church was young as well. During this rotation, it's early voices of the church fathers, of early church fathers. And so they're shorter biographies that help us see who was doing what during the time frame.
I love that one too, because it brings in ones that I personally had never heard of. It was fascinating to kind of hear from some of those other voices that aren't in your standard books about that time. So I really love that one.
I think it helps us to see the church history is part of what we're studying as a whole. It's not its own separate thing, though we have a separate subject for it. It pulls in the same time frame, just like Mason does with the historical streams. It fits in the time frame, and so it gives a better picture of what's going on with the early church that we sometimes miss out on. In grade 12, citizenship, we cover economics, civics, and ethics. Depends upon the term and the grade and the rotation, how it all works together. But for this year, as we talk through it, one of the things that we should really mention is that the continuation of economics from What Would Keynes Do? It was a new book this last year. We've had a wonderful response to it. It's a really good, accessible introduction to the economic theory and practices from different viewpoints, actually. And it allows your students to think through the different ways it's practically applicable in their life. In grade 12, in civics, we also use this book called 1919 that talks about many events that happened during that year that really impact the rest of the future of America. Things from immigration to a molasses spill in a city and a disaster to the suffrage, and on forward through the rest of the term, we'll be studying this book. It'll give you a good picture of things that are happening throughout the term. So it also has a lot of photography in it as well. I mentioned that photography is a big piece of how we view history during the 20th century, and that's included in this book as well. So for ethics, we use different books for the terms. One of the books that we use this year is brought back. It's called Culture Care. You've probably seen it before. This is a really important book about how to look at beauty and how to reconnect with beauty in our common life, is what he calls it. So Makoto Fujimura wrote this book, and it helps us re-engage with art and beauty as we interact as citizens.
There'll be a really interesting connection with the architecture book too, just to kind of see how those books really kind of talk about a similar subject, but in really different ways. So that'll be an interesting comparison.
And another kind of tie-in book is this book is used in grade 12 for the last term as well, called Conscience. And it deals with that same idea of how to interact with people when we as believers disagree about something, when our conscience tells us something different, and how do we engage in civil conversation? How do we give grace to each other? And think about how we can love those who differ with us. In English in 12th grade, we're moving into a new phase. We've studied more about how to write with essays and given specific instruction on that. We've had composition throughout the years. We've studied words and their use. And then in 11th grade, the style. In 12th grade, we kind of bring those things together, and we talk about how words are used in our culture today, how we as writers are responsible for the words that we use and how to use them well. So this Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies is a really important book that we study in grade 12. As well as we look at this across the whole year, the craft of research. The idea of there's a very specific way of writing for research and how to use research appropriately and what our audiences think about it and how to write research papers and use research in our writing. So it moves you beyond the beginning levels into a much more deep understanding of writing and how to use your skills that you've gained through the years in high school.
It's really fascinating too how books, that you would think, okay, these are composition type books, but like that one about the culture of lies, right? It crosses over into citizenship and Bible and other categories, which is really neat to see how that whole interconnection happens again in these different subjects for 12th grade. So moving into geography, there are some similarities between the lower years, but there's some unique features of the 12th grade curriculum for geography. We will be finishing up the whole Across This Land. So we've been reading this over several different years, several different rotations. If you're new, you can just pick up where the lesson plans will be, and or you can finish it, right? It's easy to jump in at the point. You don't have to have read the whole thing to be able to follow the lesson plans, but you might find that you want to finish it anyway. So it's a fascinating look at just more kind of, it's very narrative in how it's looking at the people and how the land has been developed over the years, and what does that history and the geography together say about who these people are that have lived and inhabited the land there. So it's a fascinating look. It gives you also across Canada, so the US and Canada both are all covered. As well, there is for those of you who did the 9th grade curriculum where we did the Prisoners of Geography, this is another book by Marshall called The Power of Geography. So it is a sequel in a sense, but it does stand alone. So if you didn't read Prisoners of Geography in grade 9, that's perfectly fine. This is another look at 10 maps again, and how those geographical features are affecting the history, the current events, the political climate, what's happening in those areas, and how that geography intersects with that. So just another, that Prisoners of Geography book has been a favorite for years. So we've used this just a couple of years now, but it's I think fascinating for students to be able to see just that kind of playing out all right in front of them on a map. And then there's some other really fascinating ones for this time period. One is called To the Edges of the World, to the Edges of the Earth. And it talks about 1909, the race for the 3 poles. So I will leave your students to tell you what that 3rd pole is, because it's kind of a mystery. But it's a fascinating look at exploration and what happens throughout this age, and covers multiple different adventures, really. So it's a very fast-paced, kind of interesting book to read about exploration. And then another very fascinating one, which is one of my favorites, is called The World in a Grain, which you wouldn't think has a very catchy title by itself. But when you look at the subtitle, which is the story of sand and how it transformed civilization, that's what really caught my attention initially, because who would have thought that sand could be so interesting? But it is actually a fascinating account of, specifically in this time period, how something like sand has ramifications all around the globe because of building, and even to the point, there's a section that talks about the fact that there are people who steal beaches. So I'm sure, don't know if it'll be your favorite book, but it is certainly one that is very interesting and exciting, and looking at the world from a very different perspective.
Okay, our history rotation this year is the modern times, and there are so many heavy topics and things that we're covering, lots of war, but there's so many wonderful things that are happening as well. So we want to make sure that our students have a good rounded picture of what's going on. As we start with the US history, use this history spine for all rotations. It's a really approachable book. It's a little bit more difficult for younger students, but it's balanced out with some other areas as well. So that's our main history spine. However, we also have some topical things as we go through the terms as well this year. And one of the books that I'm really excited about it's called Years of Dust. It is The Story of the Dust Bowl by Alveary, and he does a really good job of making this time frame you feel like you're there with the people and what they're going through and what it's about. There's a lot of pictures that are in the book that talk about the times, and it shows you from the Great Plains and the migration to California, but what's going on in different places. It encompasses the Great Depression as well. And so so our students will get a really good, more in-depth look of the US during this time frame, and what the Years of Dust were really about, and even the ecology and the things that we need to think of as far as agriculture and how that impacts our times in our world. So that's a really exciting one. We mentioned that this one had a lot of pictures in it. There are a lot of the photograph and the media changes in the 20th century and the 21st century as we talk about history and news and the way we see our history, and even the common way that we are able to experience history through photographs and audio and video as we move forward. One of the books that we use is about Lewis Hine and his social work for helping the case against child labor, and the photographs that he used to bring that to the national attention and change things. So that's part of our books for the 10th and 11th grade. There are some other books that we use that also address specific issues, but they're really related to the photography and even TV. When TV was coming about into the national, when TV was coming about, and people nationally were able to watch the Kennedy-Nixon debates, and how did that change things in the way we perceive our history as well. So that piece is part of what we will be studying a lot of. In the same way, there's a book. Okay, so this is a DVD of The Bridge of Spies. You can stream this. Okay, this is me and my age owning the DVD, but you can stream it. It is a really good story based on a true story about the Cold War era and the concerns and the fears of communism and how that's dealt with in American life. And so this is a really good, a very good movie for us to watch as students and to kind of think through some of those really important ideas about what was going on during the time frame and the mindset of people. So the last book I want to share with you for American history is for 10th and 11th grade. This covers it's a really, really interesting book. It's called 5 Presidents, An Extraordinary Journey. And there's 5 presidents who this Secret Service agent served. And it's his time in the White House and serving these presidents. And you get a picture of all the things that are going around, the hard decisions and the hard things that come when you're talking about a president's life and what he has to deal with and just all the things that surround that. So this is a really good peek into the presidency and politics and what goes on in a bipartisan way. Okay, so for 20th century, because it's so specific with modern times, we have a different spine that we used. This is concise and short, but it's also a little bit heftier. So we use it for 10th, 11th, and 12th grade only. Not the younger years, but it does a really good job of giving us an overview of what's happening. One particular event that we really want to talk about, however, that's not as covered in depth, that's really has a huge world impact, is the story of the Vietnam War. This is the history of the war as well. So it talks about the lead up to what was going on in Vietnam that created conflict originally. What was happening between the peoples and the surrounding nations? What about other nations' involvement? And way before the American involvement in the war, what was going on and why were these conflicts in there? It helps us to understand the progression and what even we were doing there as Americans. But as we look at the world and the impact it has on it, Russell Friedman does a really good job of bringing this forward in an approachable, age-appropriate way, even dealing with hard topics, but in a way that high schoolers will be able to deal with that directly and appropriately. So I'm excited about that one and being able to know more. I reread it again and I learned a bunch. I wasn't aware of a lot of the things that came before and how it moved forward. And so so that I think you might enjoy reading that along with your students. Okay, ancient history. So in ancient history, we have our ancient history rotation that changes each year. And this year we're talking a lot about we moved from the rise of Christianity into the Byzantium and the fall of Rome and our perspective around that. This is one of the books that's used for that, for the 10th and 11th grade, as well as adding the rise of Islam. That's a huge world event that has a lot of impact even for today. So we look through those things as we read some history, but also in some ways story about these individuals and the people that take place in that time. We have a lot of art and artifacts and things that are specific to the lesson plans that aren't included in these resources, but that give you a rounded idea of how the continuum moves forward with these different areas and different nations and their art and their culture and even their literature. So that's a great coverage for our ancient history this year. So one of the topics we cover in our history rotations, in our history streams, we've called cultural history. It's a little bit different. It's just kind of a translation piece. Mason actually did do this in her studies as well. How from before you would study at very early ages, just a broad understanding of your place, and then you would move from there out, and then you would gather stories about an individual to understand what was going on in the world at the time. That gave you a little look at what else was happening besides that one individual's life and their biography, but what was going on in their world, and help you walk in their shoes a little bit. And that's really what the cultural history does at the older level. We have, of course, moved back to broader overviews of history, maybe even some more chronologically topical subjects that we cover, but we don't lose the cultural aspect of that and understanding who people are to our world and to our time and the time that we're studying. So we have 3 very interesting books that are assigned for grade 12. The first one is The Harvey Girls. It's really fascinating peek into the lives of these women who went with the trains toward the West, and as that was the main way of travel at the beginning of the century, the 20th century. They worked in the restaurants that Harvey owned and really kind of made that movement happen, and their lives of what was going on when they were moving west, and the people and the immigrants, the immigration, the movement of the other peoples that they saw as well. The next one's called Between Shades of Gray. This is a really fascinating, a critical book, I would say. It's a historical novel, and it's based on the time frame of World War II and Stalin, and the activity that we don't really see a lot during World War II when we focus on the European theater. We forget about this part, and this is the deportation and imprisonment of Lithuanians and other ethnicities in that area that were taken to the gulags and hidden and put in work camps. And so this is a look through the eyes of a family and how they get through that. So this is only in grade 12 because it does have a lot of difficult content. There's also a movie by the same name. I would not necessarily recommend that, or by a different name, but about the same book. It's just a really hard look. So you will find yourself crying and hoping with the characters in this book, along with your student if you're reading it. But it is I think it's a really important look at a piece of the World War II time frame that we miss sometimes too. And the last one for cultural history is back in the United States, but really has a huge world impact, right? Because it's Hidden Figures, and it's all about these women who are mathematicians at a time frame when they were not only women, but they were Black women in an era when they weren't very well respected. And so it's they use their talents to help in the space race that you'll be studying in history as well. And it's a really good look at that. And we do actually recommend the movie that goes along with this for grade 12. We also cover poets from the time frame like Robert Frost or Yeats, or T.S. Eliot, depending upon where they fall within the year. But there's 2 I specifically want to point out to you. One is this book called How I Discovered Poetry by Marilyn Nelson. And it is a poetic memoir seen through her eyes as a child as she goes through the civil rights movement and even the Red Scare movement and the communism concerns and the communist concerns, and really just how she sees that as a child and growing up through that. So it's a great book. I think you'll get a lot of good discussion. It's very approachable and easy to read poetry as it takes you through her journey in life as a child. The last book on poetry that I want to mention to you, we include poetry by Alveary. It's called This Day, Collected in New Sabbath Poems. And it has a little bit more of a spiritual and reflective emphasis, which is different from some of the other poets that we're talking about this year. And even the poetry, it has a different restful kind of feel that I think brings in some of that balance for the year that we were looking for our students, giving a little bit of rest. Now, talking about literature for grade 12, there's a lot of similarities with the other grades. We do have so many overlaps, but one of the things to note in literature is we're covering a lot of history as well. We mentioned the idea that there's this crossover with history and literature and ethics and culture and how all those things mix together. We bring in different voices as well. And one of the ways we do that is during this time, you have classic children's literature as well as short stories that really become predominant in the literature of the time. And this is a book called Tevye the Dairyman. They're short stories that are out of Russia. It's a classic Russian author. And you'll probably know the character more from the Fiddler on the Roof. And we actually will watch that as well. Because of the different media used in literature as well, and the movement towards short stories becoming TV shows or movies, we're going to make sure we're adding those in and we're able to look at, okay, this was the actual book. What is the movie like? And do a little bit of analysis as well as a student as you look at the differences and what that brings in the literary genre and movement. The author we have here is Conrad Richter. He is from the time frame, but it reaches back a little bit. This is the first of his book in a trilogy, the Awakening Land trilogy called The Trees. The others are listed in extra reading if your students would like to read them. They have a little bit of a warning because there's some more mature content. This one is fine. It gives you a good flair for or a good understanding of the flair for his Conrad Richter's writing and the agricultural piece that is brought into a lot of literature at this time frame. And so this is a really good look at that picture. It's fun, it's easy to read, it's a engaging story. The short stories we have are I'm going to cover a lot of different areas. So we'll have them in the program, and you have other resources from O. Henry and H.G. Wells. We have Harrison Bergeron, which is a really important dystopian short story by Kurt Vonnegut. And there is a short film that goes along with that called 2081 that you'll want to watch. Actually, it's star-studded. There's lots of really important stars in there, but it goes through dystopian lifestyle and what's going on, and it will be an interesting discussion with your student after they've read that. We also read Flannery O'Connor stories, and one of the books I want to show you specifically is this book is by Patrick McManus. He's written several short stories here. The Good Samaritan Strikes Again, and it's one of the ways that we are using short stories to lighten up the load a little bit, just lighten up the mood even. So they're fun and lighthearted short stories that make everybody laugh. And so that's a good way to bring in some balance for some of those other short stories that have a heavier load for content, especially at a time when you're also doing some other dystopian things. So this is a dystopian novel that the grade 12 will be reading the first part of, talking about the end of the world and what happens after or what happens before. And I'll let your students read through that.
It's really important when we think about that whole balance. It's not only balance in difficulty of types of books, but it's also just in the mood and especially for this time period and the rotation that we're in. It's just to have that, making sure that it's not all heavy and difficult reading, but there's definitely some hopeful and light things that are included as well.
And we do that with the plays as well for grade 12. We bring in a couple of extra plays. So we do have a Shakespeare play in there as well, but we also have period writing. So we have a classic children's play Peter Pan and the Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up. So that's one of the works that we'll be reading, as well as the importance of being earnest and an opera for Saints in Three Acts. So you'll get a very different view of some authors and playwrights and the works that they do during this time frame that'll help give you some different perspectives on other things that are happening in the world.
And then to conclude, we're just going to talk a little bit about science. It looks a little different in grade 12. There are 4 different electives to choose from, and they are kind of have this mix of citizen science as well as investigating the topic and going deeper. There's a lab component. More as just trying to really broaden out, right? Typically, we've got the physics and the biology and chemistry like you'd expect, but then this gives some choices and just following some interests and remembering all the way along. There's a high school science library that there are lots of different subjects covered, and books are being added to that every year to be able to give students just a really wide feast of science readings that they can choose from any time as well. But actually in the curriculum for these different electives, I'll just give a few highlights. There's this one on, here you go, it is 101 geosites that you've got to see. So it's fascinating because it's geology is one of those subjects where you can read about it, but if you can go places and actually see the different things, it just really brings it to life. Now, we don't all have the ability to travel in the same way, but depending on where you live, there are different sites across the country, and you can possibly pick a vacation place that maybe there's something there that you could see if there's something to go see. So it kind of gives you an overview of all these different places, but then also gives you some things for what you might be able to see in your own region. And then as well, there's also some classic geology writing that is just, he's a famous, John McVie is known for his geology writing for years. This is just sort of one of the intro books to his series, and kind of gives you a deeper dive into, well, why does the outside look the way it does, right? How does the world, what's created this, in the sense of what are the forces in the actual way that the mountains and the different things have come about. So kind of a really closer look at some of the geology. And then in the botany, we have several kind of covers a broad range of different things, from the plant hunters, so sort of looking at the how did we even discover these things, because that type of book, as well as like an in-depth look at seeds. It's a fabulous series of books called Seeing Seeds. It's got the combination of seeing things up close, and you get a really good look at like what does it look like from under a microscope, right? Like how do we even see the world of seeds up close, and what can we learn from that, and seeing it from a different perspective. So there's several books, multiple ones that change through the terms that kind of combine that idea of getting out there into the world and looking at things, but also reading more in depth on a subject than you might have on the earlier grades. There's another one that's just very makes sense for where we're at in our world currently, and one about viruses, Planet of Viruses. It was written before COVID, but Carl Zimmer is an expert in his field, and he has a lot to say just on understanding that particular part of microbiology. So it's one of the books for that. And there's another one that goes into microbes and all of the current study about all the microbes that are within us. Whole nother world of microbiology to study that's just really blooming, and there's all sorts of new research coming out. So that's but there's also labs, again, like I said, for all of these different ones, and how to make this really a part of your life going forward as seniors, just looking at science not as subjects that we've covered, obviously, but as just a part of your world and your life. And how do we make that, those habits and practices and really enjoyable and part of your everyday. In the astronomy one, here's an example. Just there's 100 nights, 100 things, sorry, to see in the night sky, and the just the practical, again, nature of, okay, here's where these things are, and where do we look, and what time, and how do we see them, and it really gives very specific guidance on how to find things. It's not just a whole look up and it's overwhelming, but it really points out specific things and helps you to find them. So that's a part of the astronomy. There's also more of an in-depth look at the different subject areas of it, and there's some math and projects that go along with that, and looking at it in terms of faith as well, and having conversations about worldview. That's all kind of woven into those different books for astronomy. So that concludes our book talk for grade 12. We are so glad that you joined us, and we look forward to your adventures with the Alveary curriculum. Thank you.